European history. The Cold War, 1945–1917. The Cold War, 1945–1917. The Cold War was a global conflict of the bad relations between the Western capitalist powers that believed in liberalism and democracy like Britain, France, Canada, Belgium, Italy, Sweden, Switzerland, Norway and Denmark, among others, led by USA, and the Eastern powers that believed in communism, led by the Soviet Union, Russia and her allies like Albania, Yugoslavia, Poland, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary and East Germany, among others. This conflict developed after World War I and II between the two superpowers and their respective allies. The conflict is referred to as the Cold War because it did not involve actual fighting. Instead, the rival powers attacked each other with propaganda or psychological warfare and economic measures, as well as a general policy of non-cooperation. The Cold War became a major threat to world peace in the post-World War I and II period, because it was characterized by tension, fear, suspicion, military skirmishes and conflicts between the Eastern or Communist bloc led by the Soviet Union, Russia, and the Western or capitalist bloc led by USA. The Cold War originated from the ideological differences that existed between the Western powers and the Soviet Union, Russia. While the Western powers led by the USA wanted the spread of liberal democracy and capitalism throughout the world, the Soviet Union, Russia, on the other hand, wanted communism to be spread throughout the world. Communism is the belief in the system of government ownership of resources like land, factories, railways and banks, among others, and equal distribution of wealth. On the other hand, capitalism believes in private ownership of the factors of production. The causes of the Cold War. The differences in ideology between the capitalist or liberal democratic states led by USA and the communist states led by the Soviet Union, Russia, caused the Cold War. Before World War I and II, there were marked differences in ideologies in that the Western powers led by USA wanted the spread of liberal democracy and capitalism throughout the world, while the Soviet Union, Russia, on the other hand, wanted communism to be spread throughout the world. After World War I and II, these differences intensified when USA and the Soviet Union emerged as the leading superpowers of the world. This was worsened when communist governments were established by Russia in much of Central and Eastern Europe, which divided the continent between two hostile camps or blocks of the communist and non-communist capitalist nations with profound political, social and economic differences. The non-communist nations made what came to be called Western Europe, or the Western Bloc led by the USA. The communist countries made up Eastern Europe, or the Eastern Bloc. These countries were Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland and Romania, and the Soviet Union, Russia. Both blocs gathered allies between 1945 and 1948, and this marked the beginning of the Cold War, as it led to fear and suspicion between the capitalist and communist states. The disagreements in the Yalta and Potsdam conferences of February 1945 and July-August 1945 respectively led to the occurrence of the Cold War. These wartime conferences were held between Britain, the Soviet Union, Russia and USA to discuss the future administration of Germany after World War I and II, among other issues. However, the Allied powers failed to agree on the future of Germany. The Western Allied powers led by USA wanted to create a new Germany under a liberal European history. The Cold War, 1945–1917. Later, the USA, Britain and France united the Western zones and established the Federal Republic of West of Germany. The Soviet Union responded by forming the Democratic Republic of Germany in East Germany. This division of Germany became a major source of tension between the Western Allied powers and the Soviet Union after World War I and II, hence leading to the occurrence of the Cold War. The Russian imperialism caused a conflict with the Western powers, which led to the occurrence of the Cold War. After World War I and II, the Western European powers were giving up control over their colonies. However, the Soviet Union, Russia, took a firm control over a number of countries like Poland, Bulgaria, East Germany, Hungary and Czechoslovakia, and dominated them politically, militarily, and also exploited them economically. This was seen as a violation of the freedom of individuals, which Russia had promised Winston Churchill of Britain and Franklin Roosevelt of USA at the Yalta Conference of February 1945 towards the end of World War I and II. This therefore annoyed the Western powers, thus causing a conflict that led to the occurrence of the Cold War. The spread of communism into Eastern Europe caused the Cold War between Russia and the Western powers. During World War I and II, Russia liberated a number of countries in Eastern Europe from the Nazi or German occupation like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria and Albania. Consequently, after World War I and II, Russia established communist regimes in most of these states, which spread communism into Eastern Europe. This threatened the Western powers led by the USA, which were capitalist, and therefore they embarked on a policy of trying to contain or stop the spread of Russian communism. This increased tension between the Western powers led by USA and the Soviet Union, Russia, which led to the occurrence of the Cold War. The 1946 Iron Curtain speech made by Winston Churchill led to the occurrence of the Cold War. An March 1946, the former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill visited USA where delivered what came to be known as the Iron Curtain speech, in which he condemned the policies of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. He stated that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe from Stettin in the Baltic Sea in the north to Trieste in the Adriatic Sea in the south. By this he meant the efforts by the Soviet Union to block itself and its satellite states in Eastern Europe from open contact with the Western powers. He therefore called for an alliance between Britain and USA against the Soviet Union, which he accused of establishing an Iron Curtain across Europe. This speech annoyed the Soviet Union and therefore widened the gap between the Soviet Union, Russia and the Western powers, thus leading to the occurrence of the Cold War. The Truman Doctrine of 1947 also led to the occurrence of the Cold War. The Truman Doctrine was an American foreign policy whose purpose was to counter or contain the Soviet geographical expansion during the Cold War. This policy was put in place in March 1947 by President Harry Truman, who became the USA president after the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt, the wartime president. Through this policy, America gave financial support to the Greek and Turkish governments against communist movements or threats in Greece and Turkey so as to prevent these two states in Eastern Europe from falling under the Soviet sphere of influence. Truman, through the pledge American support for other nations that were threatened by the Soviet aggression or communism. This doctrine threatened the Soviet Union and therefore caused a conflict between the two European history. The Cold War, 1945-1917. Communism on the European continent. It was believed by USA that those Western European nations that benefited from this American economic aid would reject communism and instead ally with the USA. What caused the Cold War was that Russia under President Joseph Stalin reacted by preventing the states of Eastern Europe where she had influence to go for the Marshall Aid Plan aid even when they would have wished to do so. This greatly annoyed USA, hence causing the Cold War. The Molotov Plan of 1947 also led to the occurrence of the Cold War. This was the system created by the Soviet Union in 1947 in order to provide economic aid to rebuild the countries in Eastern Europe that were politically and economically aligned to the Soviet Union. It was a counter-reaction to the Marshall Aid Plan of 1947 and therefore it symbolized the Soviet Union's refusal to accept economic aid from the Marshall Aid Plan or allow any of her satellite states in Eastern Europe to do so. This was because of the belief that the Marshall Aid Plan was an attempt to weaken the Soviet influence in their satellite states by making the beneficiary countries to depend on the United States of America. Through this system, the Soviet Union even encouraged and sponsored the economic integration of the communist states in Eastern Europe and elsewhere in the world, which later led to the formation of an economic organization known as the COMEC and the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance in 1949. This promoted cooperation between the Soviet Union and the communist states in Eastern Europe. This further annoyed USA, which trying to contain the expansion of the Soviet influence in Eastern Europe, thus leading to the occurrence of the Cold War. The Cold War also intensified by the conference that was held in Warsaw, the capital of Poland, in September 1947. The conference was a counter-reaction of the Marshall Aid Plan. It was held by the communist countries to coordinate communist activities that were determined in Moscow, the capital of Russia. This conference resulted into the formation of the Communist Information Bureau or Office in Warsaw to coordinate communist political parties in Europe. The conference therefore increased the conflicts between the capitalist powers in the West and the communist countries in the East, which led to the occurrence of the Cold War. The Berlin blockade incident of 1948 to 1949 led to the occurrence of the Cold War. This was an attempt by Russia to block all roads, railways and canals linking West Berlin and West Germany, which was under the Allied powers. During the Potsdam Conference of July-August 1945, Berlin, the former capital of Germany, which lay in the Soviet Eastern Zone, was divided into 3 Western sectors and 1 Soviet sector, with the Western sectors later becoming West Berlin and the Soviet sector becoming East Berlin, the capital of East Germany. West Berlin was therefore completely surrounded by the East German territory, which was under Russian control. This division of Berlin later generated an enmity between the Western Allied powers and the Soviet Union Russia. This forced Russia to create a blockade on the city of West Berlin in 1948. This was aimed at preventing food and other supplies from arriving in West Berlin so as to force the Allied powers out of the city. This created scarcity of goods for the local population and the armed forces of the Western powers that were still stationed in West Berlin. The Western powers responded to the blockade by organizing the Berlin Airlift of June 1948-May 1949 to carry supplies to the people of West Berlin, which was a difficult task given the big size of the city's population. The Soviet Union did not disrupt the airlift for fear that this might lead to open conflict. She instead decided to lift the European history, the Cold War, 1945-1970, help each other against aggression in Europe and the North Atlantic area, and it also meant that this organization NATO stood against the aggression by Communist Russia. In reaction, the Soviet Union Russia formed the Warsaw Pact in 1955 with her communist allies that included Poland. Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, East Germany, Albania, and Czechoslovakia. The Warsaw Pact was not to allow the influence of the Western powers in the member countries. These alliances increased tension and suspicion between the capitalist and communist powers, thus leading to the occurrence of the Cold War. The revival of the arms race led to the occurrence of the Cold War. After World War II, there was a nuclear arms race or competition in the manufacture of nuclear weapons between USA, the Soviet Union, Russia, and their respective allies. For example, in 1949 Russia developed an atomic bomb, which shocked the Western powers. This was a challenge especially to the monopoly of the Americans in the manufacture of the atomic weapons and technological warfare. This marked the birth of the competition between the two superpowers to develop weapons capable of destroying all their opponents within a few minutes. The United States reacted to the competition by developing the nuclear bombs as well as the hydrogen bomb in 1952. Russia also did the same in 1953. This increased tension between the Western and Eastern blocs, thus leading to the occurrence of the Cold War. The success of the Chinese Revolution of 1949 also led to the occurrence of the Cold War. This revolution involved the defeat of the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek in China, which was under American support. The government was defeated by the communists under the leadership of Mao Tse-tung, who was supported by the Soviet Union, Russia, and he established a new government he called the People's Communist Republic of China in October 1949. The nationalists who had been defeated took over the neighboring island of Taiwan and regarded themselves as the true Chinese and were even recognized by the UNO. The presence of a communist regime in China supported by the Soviet Union and Russia increased the enmity between Russia and the Western powers that supported the Chinese in Taiwan, thus leading to the occurrence of the Cold War. The role of the international press propaganda caused the Cold War. The newspapers in USA and Britain, like the New York Times and the Daily Telegraph respectively, as well as those in Russia, published information about their rivals, including military secrets, sometimes with exaggeration. This negative press propaganda poisoned the minds of the politicians in either camps. This increased tension between the Western Allied powers led by USA and the Soviet Union, Russia, which led to the occurrence of the Cold War. The demise of compromising leaders led to the occurrence of the Cold War. Both the Western and Eastern blocs witnessed the disappearance of good and compromising leaders who had struggled to promote good international relations. These were instead replaced by uncompromising leaders who got involved in bitter exchange of words that built tension and worsened the already fragile relationship between the West and East. For example, there was President Franklin D. Roosevelt of USA, who died on 12 April 1945 and was replaced by Harry Truman. In Britain, there was Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who was replaced by Winston Churchill in October 1940, while in the European history, the Cold War, 1945-1917, both military and intelligence information from their rivals. This information was then published in the different newspapers, which worsened the relations between the Western and Eastern blocs. For example, there was the Central Intelligence Agency CIA of USA, the Federal Bureau Investigations FBI of Britain, KGB of the Soviet Union, Russia, as well as the Mossad of Israel. This increased fear and suspicion that eventually led to the occurrence of the Cold War. The struggle to control the world economic resources also led to the occurrence of the Cold War. There was a bitter struggle between the Western powers led by USA and the Soviet Union, Russia, in the post-World War II period to access and dominate the economic resources of the world, especially minerals like oil, diamond, and gold. This, together with the desire to control the strategic places of the world like the Suez Canal in Egypt, Constantinople in Turkey, the Mediterranean and Black Seas, as well as the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, made the two superpowers and their allies to clash in the different parts of the world. This increased tension between the two rival camps, which eventually brought about the occurrence of the Cold War. The Korean War or conflict of 1950 to 1953 also caused the Cold War between the Western powers and the Soviet Union, Russia. The Korean peninsula had been part of the Japanese Empire, but after World War II, Korea was split into two divisions, North and South Korea. However, in June 1950, North Korea, which was supported by Communist Russia under Joseph Stalin, invaded South Korea, which was capitalist and democratic. The USA, through the UNO, intervened to stop the invasion by supporting South Korea. The result was that a peace agreement was signed and the hostilities temporarily ended. This confrontation between USA and the Soviet Union, Russia, increased the enmity between the two superpowers, hence leading to the occurrence of the Cold War. The Arab-Jewish conflict in the Middle East caused the Cold War. This conflict originated from the bad relations between Israel and her Arab neighbors like Syria, Jordan, and Egypt since 1948, when the Jewish state of Israel was established on what the Arabs called their land. Both the Soviet Union, Russia, and the Western powers conflicted over this issue because the two rival camps gave arms, funds, and technical advice to the warring parties. The Western powers supported Israel while Russia supported the Arab states. This increased enmity between the two sides, which led to the occurrence of the Cold War. The struggle for world supremacy or dominance between USA and the Soviet Union and Russia also led to the occurrence of the Cold War. These two nations had emerged as the leading superpowers after World War II, replacing Britain and France, which were the traditional superpowers in the world. In the post-World War II period, each of these two superpowers wanted to outcompete the other. As a result, they tried to get as many allies as possible, especially in Africa, Asia and other strategic areas of the world, leading to clashes between the two superpowers. These clashes increased the enmity between the USA and Russia together with their respective allies, which led to the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 also led to the occurrence of the Cold War. In October 1962, the Soviet Union and Russia sent nuclear missiles to her Latin American communist ally Cuba in order to protect her from a planned invasion by capitalist USA. This move by the Russians threatened USA, which responded to the installation of the missiles by imposing a naval blockade on Cuba that lasted until November 1962, when Russia removed the missiles following the pressure from the United. European history at the Cold War, 1945-1917. Maintaining world peace after World War II. The USA and the Soviet Union and Russia were permanent members of the Security Council of the UNO, but the UNO failed to stop these two superpowers from producing weapons of mass destruction in the post-World War II period. This revived the arms race not only between these two superpowers but also in the entire world, which eventually contributed to the occurrence of the Cold War. The effects of the Cold War on Europe. The Cold War had both positive and negative effects on Europe, as noted below. The positive effects of the Cold War. The Cold War led to the spread of capitalism and communism by the superpowers. As the Cold War raged on, each of the two superpowers became determined to spread their ideologies to other parts of the world. For example, communism was spread by the Soviet Union and Russia to Eastern Europe, especially in the Balkan states and the Russian satellite states like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Albania and Hungary. On the other hand, capitalism was extended by the USA to many countries in Western Europe. This promoted friendship or cooperation between those countries that embraced the different ideologies with the two superpowers. The Cold War increased the flow of capital or aid into the member countries of the various hostile camps. Each of the two superpowers decided to extend foreign aid to their respective allies as a way of winning them on their respective sides. For example, there was the flow of the Marshall Aid from the USA to Western Europe to reconstruct the shattered economies of Britain, France and West Germany. In reaction, the Soviet Union Russia gave financial aid to the Eastern European countries through the Molotov Plan of 1947 in order to counter the Marshall Aid Plan. This aid from the two superpowers led to economic recovery in Europe after the destructive World War II. The Cold War promoted education in the satellite states. During the Cold War, many foreign students in the American and Russian satellite states of Europe were offered scholarships by their respective superpowers to study abroad as a way of indoctrinating them into either capitalism or communism by the two superpowers. This was because the students who studied in those countries became major proponents of those ideologies whenever they returned to their home countries. This promoted educational advancement in many countries. It led to the advancement in science and technology. During the Cold War era, there was serious competition in science and technology between the Western powers led by the USA and the Eastern Bloc led by the Soviet Union and Russia. Each camp tried to improve its political, economic and military capabilities by carrying out intensive scientific research and innovations. This eventually brought about many scientific discoveries like advanced military weapons, computers and robots, which promoted rapid development in the two camps up to 1970. The Cold War further strengthened the alliances in Western Europe with USA and Canada. The growing threats from Communist Russia during the Cold War era created an urgent need for unity and cooperation between the Western European nations and USA together with Canada, which led to the formation of North Atlantic Treaty Organization NATO in 1949. The formation of this organization therefore helped to promote transatlantic cooperation between USA, Canada and the Western European countries like Britain, France, Belgium and Italy, among others. European history. The Cold War, 1945-1917. Two superpowers and their respective allies. This helped to create military balance of power between the Western and the Eastern powers. Because of this, therefore, there was peace without a major war breaking out in the world in the period 1945 to 1970. The Cold War led to the presence of USA troops in Europe. These troops were brought to Europe by USA so as to protect the Western capitalist nations from a possible Russian aggression, which was very imminent or likely, as Russia wanted to spread her communist ideology in the region at all costs. This invasion was likely to happen at any time given the way the Soviet Union had invaded many Eastern European nations immediately after World War II. These American troops helped to maintain peace and stability in Europe. The Cold War led to the formation of the Warsaw Pact in 1955. The Warsaw Pact was a military alliance established in 1955 between the Soviet Union and numerous Eastern Bloc states like Poland, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Romania and Albania. The major aims or objectives of the Warsaw Pact of 1955 were to counter the spread of capitalism, promote economic cooperation among the communist states as well as to spread communism among others. It was therefore established as a defensive alliance against the threats from the NATO or Western powers. The Warsaw Pact helped to promote close cooperation between the Eastern European nations that were communist and the Soviet Union Russia up to 1970. It led to the competition in space exploration between USA and the Soviet Union Russia. Because of the Cold War, there was competition for the dominance of the space and the moon in particular between USA and the Soviet Union using rockets, satellites and other techniques as a way of showing which superpower had more knowledge of the universe. For example, 1959 the Soviet Union sent a rocket to the moon which landed on 14 September 1959 and this was the first man-made object to reach the moon. In an effort to compete with the Soviet success, USA embarked on a project to launch a man into the Earth orbit and also to land a human being on the moon. But on 12 April 1961, the Soviet-Russian Yuri Gagarin became the first human being in space and the first to orbit the Earth. As a result, on 20 July 1969, USA sent its spaceflight or rocket which landed the first two people on the moon and these were Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. This race in space exploration resulted into more scientific discoveries and innovations by mankind. The Cold War led to the formation of the Non-Aligned Movement (NAM) in 1961. This movement was started by Nehru, the Prime Minister of India, President Josip Tito of Yugoslavia and President Sukarno of Indonesia among others. The NAM was officially born in 1961 during the Belgrade Conference that was held in Yugoslavia. This organization was formed to encourage Third World countries to be neutral by not taking sides during the Cold War either with NATO or the Warsaw Pact members. The movement therefore helped to unite those Third World countries of Asia and Africa that chose to be neutral in the Cold War and also safeguarded the member countries from the direct confrontation with either the West or East. The Cold War led to economic integration in Europe. For example, there was the formation of the Western European Union in October 1954 and later the European Economic Community (EC) in 1957 by the Western European nations. These organizations began as a response to the American offer of the Marshall Aid Plan as the Western European countries organized themselves to draw up a European history. The Cold War, 1945-1917. Negative effects of the Cold War. The Cold War led to the polarization or division of Europe into two hostile camps or blocs. Because of the Cold War, Europe was divided into two antagonistic camps with divergent political and economic ideologies. These were the Western or capitalist bloc led by USA and the Eastern or communist bloc led by USSR Russia. This increased the tension, fear, suspicion and conflicts between the European powers which threatened peace and security up to 1970. The Cold War increased the arms race between the two superpowers. The Cold War contributed to a continuous state of tension, fear and suspicion between the Eastern Bloc led by the Soviet Union and the Western Bloc led by USA, which created a dare to manufacture weapons in preparation for an actual war between the two sides. This led to the manufacture of weapons of mass destruction by the two superpowers like the American thermonuclear bomb of 1954 to 1953, the atomic bomb of 1945 as well as the Russian ballistic missiles of 1957 among others. This manufacture of these deadly weapons threatened world peace up to 1970. The Cold War also led to confrontations or clashes between the USA and the Soviet Union Russia. Due to the Cold War, the two superpowers found themselves clashing or conflicting in the different parts of the world, especially in those areas that were strategically located. For example, they clashed in the Korean crisis of 1950 to 1953 as well as the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. These confrontations increased the enmity between USA and Russia, thus undermining world peace up to 1970. The Cold War promoted the decolonization of Africa and Asia, thus leading to the loss of territories by the European powers like Britain, France, Portugal and Belgium. The two superpowers USA and Russia supported independence struggles so as to extend their ideologies. For example, in Angola, USA supported a political party known as Unity the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, while Russia supported EMPLO, the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola. This eventually led to the independence of Angola from Portugal in 1975. The Cold War led to the formation of secret international spying agencies. During the Cold War, a number of antagonistic spy networks were formed by the two conflicting blocs to spy and gather secret information about their rivals. For example, there was the Central Intelligence Agency of USA, the Mossad of Israel, the Federal Bureau of Investigations FBI of Britain, as well as the KGB of Russia, among others. As these organizations spied over their opponents, this increased the tension between the two hostile camps, thus threatening international peace up to 1970. The Cold War led to the division of Germany into two parts, and these were West and East Germany. West Germany was under capitalism and therefore followed democratic and capitalist ideas, while East Germany under communism. This division was later strengthened when the Soviet Union and Russia constructed the Berlin Wall in 1961. When this huge and heavily guarded wall was built, it effectively divided West Germany from East Germany. As a result, the Germans in the East would not be allowed to cross to the West. They therefore became prisoners within their own country. The continued division of Germany into two parts increased the tension and enmity between the Western capitalist powers and the Soviet Union up to 1970, thus undermining peace. The Cold War led to political unrest or instability in Europe and countries like Czechoslovakia and Poland. This is so because there existed communist and capitalist wing political parties in these. European history. The Cold War, 1945-1917. The Cold War facilitated the rise of dictatorship in Eastern Europe while democracy flourished in Western Europe. The communist ideology was associated with dictatorship while capitalism was associated with liberal democracy. As a result, those Eastern European countries that embraced Russian communism like Yugoslavia, Romania and Poland among others fell under dictatorial regimes that were directly supported by the Soviet Union. This increased the enmity between these countries and the Western democratic nations like Britain, France and USA among others. The Cold War led the division of Berlin into two regions. Because of the continuous enmity between the Western powers in the Soviet Union during the Cold War era, Berlin, the former capital of Germany, was split up into different administrative regions by the World War II, with the Western powers of France, Britain and USA taking over what later became West Berlin, while the Soviet Union and Russia took over East Berlin. This division of Berlin further increased the enmity between the Western powers and the Soviet Union and Russia. The climax of this enmity was in 1948-1949 when Russia attempted to limit or block the ability of France, Great Britain and the United States to travel by railway, road and canal to their region of West Berlin in what came to be known as the Berlin Blockade Incident of 1948-1949. Though Russia later lifted the blockade on 12 May 1949, the incident increased the enmity between the Soviet Union and the Western powers, which undermined international peace and stability. The Cold War led to the formation of antagonistic hostile military alliances by the rival camps. These included the North Atlantic Treaty Organization NATO that was formed in 1949 as well as the Warsaw Pact formed in 1955. The NATO was composed of the Western capitalist countries while the Warsaw Pact had the membership of countries of Eastern Europe that believed in communism led by USSR Russia. The formation of these military alliances increased tension and suspicion between the capitalist and communist powers, thus undermining international peace and stability up to 1970. The Cold War undermined the operation or performance of the United Nations Organization unit, thus weakening the organization. Formed in 1945 with the primary objective of maintaining world peace, the UNO was not able to convince the superpowers to give up this conflict which threatened international peace after World War II. This therefore undermined its credibility and indeed exposed it as a weak organization. The Cold War contributed to the Anglo-French invasion of Egypt in 1956, which caused the Suez Canal crisis or War of 1956. In 1956, Egypt was invaded by Britain, France and Israel over the control of the Suez Canal in what came to be known as the Suez Canal crisis or war. Britain and France decided to join Israel against Egypt because Egypt under President Gamal Abdel Nasser had adopted communism, which did not please the other two capitalist powers. The war was a diplomatic victory by Egypt because Britain and France were forced by the United Nations General Assembly to immediately withdraw their troops from the Suez Canal zone, leading to the end of the crisis. The Cold War led to international terrorism and conflict sponsored by the Western powers led by USA on one side and Russia on the other. During the Cold War era, the two superpowers sponsored terrorist activities against each other in Europe and other parts of the world. For example, there were frequent suicide bombings, hijacking of ships and planes, as well as assassination of prominent leaders who did not subscribe to their respective ideologies. These terrorist activities contributed to European history. The Cold War, 1945-1970.